here. As I read the Republic, it seems to me that one of the most urgent concerns that Plato expresses about democracy is over what I call the cult of freedom. The cult of freedom. I think this comes out in several places in the Republic. So let me explain. This will take just 1 minute to unpack here. So Plato, through Socrates, warns that within a democratic society, as well as we'll see within what he calls a democratic man, there inevitably arises this, what he calls an insatiable longing for freedom. And Socrates says this leads to a kind of disorder or an injustice in both society and individual people. So freedom in this situation comes to be seen as the greatest good, right? Or as the highest attribute, as we've been talking about, in both the political society and in the souls of men. And to put this in Christian terms, Plato's telling us that in democracies, freedom tends to become an idol. Freedom begins to be seen as the highest good, right? An end all. Freedom becomes an end in itself, something to be pursued for its own sake, something to be worshipped. And Plato warns us that societies that value freedom above all else will inevitably end up engaging in a kind of cult of freedom. And when this happens, there is a distortion that takes place in our understanding of what freedom is, right? And ultimately, it leads to a kind of disorder, a kind of injustice within society and within the soul. So it's important to understand that for classical perennial philosophy and for the New Testament alike, freedom is defined as a state of being that's in accord with reason and virtue, right? So according to freedom as a state of being that's in accord with reason and virtue, it follows that freedom can come in degrees, right? And so the more rational, the more virtuous a person is, the freer that person is. And of course, the inverse of this will also be true. The less rational, the less virtuous a person is, the less free that person will be, according to this classical and New Testament notion of freedom. Aristotle says that to the extent that we're governed by reason and virtue, to that same extent are we living as free, rational animals, right? To be governed by the bodily appetite, to be governed by the passions, is, for Aristotle, to be less rational. It's to be less human. It's to be more animal. It's to be more beastly, right? So the same idea is expressed, I think, in different words by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. Paul says that to live according to the flesh or according to sinful desires is to live as a slave, right? As a slave of the flesh. And the person who is really and truly free, paradoxically, according to the Apostle Paul, is the person who's a slave to righteousness, right? It's the person who's, as he says, crucified the flesh with his passions and desires. So true freedom from the Christian perspective and from the classical perspective is freedom from the flesh and freedom for virtue and righteousness. This is what freedom means for Plato, for Socrates, for Plato, for Aristotle, for the Apostle Paul, for the New Testament writers. Now, of course, this understanding of freedom is almost completely foreign to people today in our modern liberal democracies. Most people today understand freedom as freedom from restraint, right? To be free in our notion of freedom today is just to be able to do what you want, to do whatever you desire. When it comes to the modern conception of freedom, I think all the emphasis is on the act of choice, like that quote you read a little bit ago, on the willing itself, right? All the attention is on the act, on the willing. There's almost no regard for the object of the choice. It's just the act of the choice that matters, not the object of the choice, or on what it is that we're willing. So what's most important for our society, what's valued above all else in our culture, is that people be allowed to choose according to their own desires, whatever those desires may be. The moral quality, the moral value of our desires and inclinations, it's no longer what chiefly matters to us as a society. What matters most is the act of choice itself, and that act be totally unfettered and without restraint. So there is today, it's so crucial to understand this, there is today a primacy of choice, right? Choice is king. This is what happens, according to Plato, in a democratic society. The exercise of choice becomes, as you were saying, the greatest good that there is, the good that ought to be pursued above all other goods. And I would argue, just as a side note, I'm not going to make the argument here, But I would say that you can't fully appreciate today the pro-choice movement apart from this distorted conception of what freedom is. I think we're never going to understand that movement unless we understand the change that's taken place in the notion of freedom. Now, this difference, I think, between the classical and the biblical idea of freedom on the one hand and the modern idea of freedom on the other, it's captured nicely by the philosopher, I always get his name wrong, I think it's Survey Pinkiers, who he was a philosopher, Catholic philosopher. He called the classical view the freedom for excellence, and he called the modern view the freedom of indifference. And freedom for excellence is just what I've been saying. It's the idea that man is ordered toward an objective good. This is Plato's idea. And that the purpose or goal of the human life is to align oneself with the objective good through the cultivation of moral and intellectual habits and virtues. And to the degree that we're able to align ourselves with the good, the objective good, to that same degree will we be free. And when we consistently choose lesser goods, this leads to the acquisition of bad habits and vices, which in turn leads to a loss of self-mastery, a loss of self-possession, a loss of self-control, which is a kind of tyranny, which is a kind of slavery. And then the freedom of indifference, which is the freedom that is, this is the way we define freedom today, freedom of indifference. This is the idea that freedom is simply the power to choose, right? The power to choose between two contraries. So freedom's no longer tied to the notion of the good or to virtue or to righteousness or to happiness understood as right living. The object, as I said, of choice drops out entirely, and it's only the choice that remains. So freedom of indifference is a freedom without any purpose. It's a freedom without any direction. It's a freedom without any goal. And because it's not pointed towards the good, because it's not pointed towards virtue, it inevitably leads to vice and a kind of slavery. Okay, let me land the plane here. So if we go back to the Republic with this distinction between the true classical idea of freedom on the one hand over against this distorted modern view of freedom on the other hand, it will help us to see, I think, why Plato thinks that democracy can so easily lead to tyranny, both in the state and, more importantly, in the soul. In the Republic, Plato, again through Socrates, says that democracies devolve into tyrannies according to, as we've seen, a certain pattern, right? First, both the ruling class and the people give themselves over to lesser goods, baser desires and passions. And this
extravagance.
Yeah, that's right. Extravagance. Yeah. This then leads to a society, as you said, that's in a state of anarchy, right? And this state of anarchy in society then opens the door to a strong man who seizes upon this state of disorder and then imposes his own order upon it, and then the people become enslaved, and you end up with tyranny. Now remember, this is the point. I think this is, I don't want to say the central message of the Republic, but this is one of the central messages of the Republic. Remember that Plato is ultimately concerned here with justice as it exists in the soul. And the political society is supposed to provide an analogy of justice in the soul. So what goes for the democratic state goes for the democratic man, right? When a person gives himself over to his basest desires and passions, extravagances, this leads his soul into a state of disorder, into a state of anarchy or injustice, right? And ultimately to a kind of tyranny in which a person becomes enslaved to his basest appetites, inclinations, and passions. And in this case, it's a person's vices that becomes the tyrant and which enslaves the soul. So paradoxically then, the soul that values freedom of choice over all else ends up becoming a slave to the tyranny of its own vices. It becomes a disordered soul, an unjust soul. This, if I may say, I think is one of Plato's central themes in the Republic, and I think this is the urgent warning for us today. We live in a modern liberal democracy that has checks and balances, and as a form of government, it's pretty stable. But that doesn't mean that we can't give ourselves over to a kind of tyranny that Plato's warning about, a tyranny of the soul, right? In his own day, Plato had witnessed pure majority rule democracies devolve into tyranny. Like he saw that happen in his own day. In our democratic constitutional republic, with all of its inbuilt systems of checks and balances, I think it's much more protected from tyranny than the classical democracies of Plato's time. So from the perspective of political government, I don't think we're in the kind of danger that Plato worried about. I think the political bones of our democratic republic are still intact. Now, but although I don't think that our democracy is in danger of political tyranny at this moment, as I said, I think we're very much in danger of what I call the tyranny of the soul. As a society, we're in danger of becoming what Plato calls the democratic man, right? As a society, we've embraced the freedom of indifference. We're engaged in the cult of choice. The act of choice, wholly apart from the object of choice, has become, for our society, the greatest good. And as a result, and just as Plato predicted, we've devolved into a tyranny of sorts. We've been enslaved by our basest appetites, our inclinations, our passions. We've traded true freedom for bondage. The soul of our nation, I think, has become disordered and unjust. And if I can just end with this, consider for a moment how Socrates describes the soul of the democratic man. Okay, just listen to this. He says that the soul of the democratic man rejects the wisdom of elders and is instead deceived by seductive arguments. It says that moral shame is nothing but simple-mindedness, that self-discipline is called cowardice, moderation is called mean and parochial, insolence, Socrates says, becomes sophistication, anarchy, freedom, extravagance, generosity, and shamelessness, courage. He writes this of the democratic man, and I'm quoting now. He says, quote, putting all his pleasures on equal footing, he grants power over himself to the pleasure of the moment, as if it were a magistrate chosen by lot. And when he has had his fill of it, he surrenders himself in turn to another pleasure. He rejects none of them, but gives sustenance to all alike. If someone tells him that some pleasures are the result of fine and good desires, others of evil desires, and that he should follow and value the first, and punish and hold in subjection the second, he does not admit this truth. He shakes his head at any claims of this sort, saying that all desires are equal and must be valued equally. And so he lives out his life from day to day, gratifying the desires of the moment, end quote. Does this not describe the current state of the American soul? According to Plato and the collective wisdom of perennial philosophy, and as I said, Christianity alike, a society that gives itself over to the cult of choice is a society in chains. It's a society under the yoke of a kind of oppressive tyranny.